Hello, everyone. My name is James Arthur, and I am an associate professor in the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins. And I am the director of the grad program in the writing seminars. And today I am going to give a poetry reading for you. This talk is going to be broken up into two sections. There's going to be a poetry reading where I will present some poems from my most recent book, The Suicide Son. And then after I've read for about 30 to 35 minutes, I will open it up for questions, and you're welcome to ask questions about individual poems if you want. But I'm also happy to just answer more general questions about poetry or poetry writing. If any of you write poetry yourself, I welcome questions about where to find inspiration or questions along those lines. So I'm just going to launch right in here. The first poem that I'm going to present was inspired by a trip that my family and I took to Ireland. And while we were there, we took a trip to Blarney Castle to kiss the famous Blarney Stone. And according to tradition, the stone, which is mounted in the battlements of Blarney Castle, the Blarney Stone, according to tradition, if you kiss the stone, and to do it, you have to sort of lean out a little bit over this over this long drop down. If you kiss the stone, supposedly you acquire the gift of the gad and become highly persuasive from that point forward. So this poem's called Eloquence. I too have been to Blarney and done the thing, the kiss, with a line of other paid-up kissers behind me, each waiting for a turn. I leaned out backward from the castle parapet into nothingness. One touch of lips to stone, they say, and you'll be eloquent all your life. My eyes were shut, so I couldn't see the upside-down abyss between me and the world below, or small figures on the ground, or any garden archipelago of green. But clutching the iron safety bar, I brought my mouth to that damp stone, whose country roughness had been rubbed away by lips of every shape and hue and tone. I want things from poetry that it could never give. Power to undo, to mend, to compel forgiveness, and forgive. I know kissing the Blarney Stone is just a thing to do to say you've done, but I thought, give me a silver tongue. Reader, if you're there, help me play the fool without becoming one, so I can be something more than a lover from afar, something more than a small town mayor in a dictator's tie, something more than a centaur at the wedding feast, with a horse's heart thumping a few feet below his human one. This next poem is a kind of sequel of sorts to Mary Shelley's famous novel Frankenstein. And as you may know, at the end of Frankenstein, the monster is on his way to the Arctic to live out the remainder of his life in frozen solitude. And this poem imagines him after he's changed his mind and is living in New York. Frankenstein's monster. I'm aging very slowly because every part of me is already dead. I spent years in the Arctic, eating seal fat and things better left unnamed. But now I've got money and a condo on the west side. I smell like formaldehyde. My teeth are grimy, my limbs mismatched. But I'm happy in this place, where I'm one more person with panache and an ugly face. I eat well. I can walk the bridge Hart Crane walked, or get drunk and not conceal it. I'm not Boris Karloff, lurching around, a mute. I hate that guy. I get laid. Here, People suffer without believing that every stranger should have to feel it. The other day, I walked from Cleopatra's Needle to the far side of the Haarlem Mere, thinking about the Rockefeller Center and the gigantic armillary sphere balanced on the shoulders of the Atlas statue there. My pants are fitted. My beret advances everywhere like a prow. My name isn't Frankenstein. Frankenstein was my inventor. I have a son, Henry, who is now 9 years old, and I wrote many of these poems when he was, when he was a toddler, and reading children's books to him is one of the, I think, one of the sort of rhythmical contributors to these poems. And so there are a number of poems in my book that in one way or another riff on the sounds and on the cadences of children's literature. So I'm sure you'll recognize the book that inspired this poem. This poem's called 100 Acre Wood. Some of these stories are too sweet for me. Winnie the Pooh is so innocent, his little songs leave me cold. But I like this, your hand across my hand, your head against my shoulder. Your first winter, I carried you even along the margins of the highway, strapped against my chest in a sling. You never can tell with bees, says Pooh, who seems to believe that almost nothing can be told. But I am your morose, restless father, and you are 4 years old. You like front-end loaders and every kind of train. I like reading to rooms of strangers and a few drinks at the airport while I'm waiting for my plane. I like the book's final chapter, a story you don't yet understand, in which boy and bear climb to Galleon's lap for one last look out across the land. At the sandy pit, the 6 pines, the 100 Acre Wood. Don't forget me, says the boy to the bear, who has no wish to understand what he does not already know. Little boy, who I carried through the winter in northern Michigan. I like hearing you in the morning when you lie in your dark room and sing. All right, the next poem that I'm going to present is a longer one, and it's called School for Boys. I believe in the power of original sin, in the wound that keeps on wounding. The son of the suicide becomes a suicide. His own son becomes a drunk. You're not meant to be so unhappy, you think. So it must be something that you've done. There must be a reason why you are the way you are. I've forgiven the teenage pedophile who lived a few doors down when I was 7. The things he did to me, I'm sure, were done to him at home. Sunday afternoons, I'd be sent out into the yard where I could do no harm beyond decapitating my mother's tulips or torturing the roly-polies that lived in the rotted out retaining wall around the flower bed. I and other boys would fight, shoplift, wreck each other's fortresses of plywood boards and brick, or earn a nickel from the beer store for every bottle that we found in the no man's land of alleys that led both north and south. The anger, the shame. Over time, these things just become a piece of who you are. You build around them since you can't burn them down. One boy, by far the most precocious forager in our tribe, stole a box of 3D movie glasses from the loading dock behind the Cineplex and brought them to my parents' house with the idea that we'd sell the glasses, pair by pair, at school. But the box sat below the deck, going nowhere. In time, its contents were scattered and destroyed. In time, I was sent to a private school dedicated to forming the whole boy, his body, his conscience, his character, his mind. There too, some men did prey on children in darkness of a different kind. My fellow students gave me lessons in strength and weakness that I will not forget. And yet, some of the faculty, masters they were called, were among the most decent men I've known. One giant of a physics teacher who sometimes would grab boys by the collar or roar into their faces while gripping them by the ear. The man roamed the corridors, scowling on a rolling cloud of fear. Brought me into his office, and after making me swear I'd never tell another boy, opened a sketch pad of watercolor paintings. They were his own, the most fragile lilies, snapdragons, and other flowers, unfolding like translucent creatures from the ocean floor. He let me sit there in silence, turning pages for half an hour. Life is not a boys' school, he told me. Be one man for the world and another for yourself. Then he put his paintings away on a high shelf. When I was 7, all that lay years ahead. In my second grade class, there was a pale, elfin redhead, I won't say his name, whose mother always sent him to school in a tie and blazer. How many times we made that boy cry, I just don't remember. He said he was an extraterrestrial in disguise and that his people would soon arrive and kill us, every one, or take us off to be vivisected. And his story didn't change when we threw his books into the trash, or when we pinned him to the ground and made him eat the dirty snow. I think I half believed him, but his people never came. I'm going to read another poem that's inspired by a children's book, and this one is based on a book by Eric Carle. Eric Carle, as some of you may know, is the author of The Very Hungry Caterpillar. This is based on another of his books called The Very Quiet Cricket, children's book, in which a newborn cricket walks across a field, unable to reply to the greetings of the mantis and the moth and the dragonfly, until his rubbing of wing on wing becomes a sound that can speak for him. When the last page turns, the book itself makes a chirruping. Here is the church and the steeple. Here is the coffee table, where the child lines up a squad of plastic people. Can the child tell the difference between himself and other things? He totters back and forth on a tractor mounted on a spring. Here is the tension of a string pulled tight, and the father rolling over and over and over in the night. The cricket book, after much rough reading, now chirrups nightly on its own. Finally, the father, knowing what must be done, opens up the book with a sturdy paring knife, looking for whatever little engine, whatever little part makes the lifelike cricket sound. Here is the trailer, the baler, the harrow, the plow? Can a stem grow up from inside a stone? Here is how to sit in silence and be alone. Here is the yard where yesterday the child sat watching as blowing branches made and remade daggers of light and shade. The book's voice box to the father's eye looks like a dime-sized bicycle bell, and as he pries it free, the chirruping intensifies, becoming something like the death cry of a creature with an actual beating heart. Something like a metal prong banging indifferently on another metal part. I'm going to switch tacks a little bit now and read a poem called Troy. The war is wrapping up, and there's nothing left of Troy. Broken stone, broken clay, a smoke stain on the sky. The Greeks even broke the skull and back of Hector's little boy. Odysseus, packing up his bags, thinks, soon I'll be home. But this afternoon belongs to Ajax, son of Telamon, standing by a flock of sheep that he's butchered in a rage. And like a man who's just shot up a shopping mall or a school bus or a bank, Ajax can answer all this killing only with the killing of himself. Soon he'll sit down and start to weep like a naughty child full of shame because he is a man killer, and a man killer does not kill sheep. The Greeks didn't come to halt a genocide or to spread democracy. Behind their great encampment are their island kingdoms, speckled against the sea. Beyond, scavenged by turning seabirds, are the pillars of Hercules, said to bear the words, "There is nothing beyond this point." And this next poem is called Drone. I am the drone of a banjo's fifth string. I am the drone that gives bottom to the chanter in a highland fling. Haw, hum. I am the drone of drone itself, planted so pleasurably in the mouth. A monotone, a lodestone. I'm an MQ-9, a reaper drone, ranging wide, circling in the sky. No windows, no cockpit, no one on board. See how my hellfires fly faster than sound. I am drone from the timble under the cicada's wing. I gather no pollen and have no sting. Arriving unheard, I haunt the sky and inseminate the queen before I die. I am a poetry that celebrates power. I bring. The White House is empty. I bomb air. I bomb breath. My country, 'tis of thee I sing. A few years ago, my family and I visited our first Renaissance festival, and it inspired this poem. The poem is just called Renaissance Fair. But not so much the Renaissance as the Middle Ages, not so much the Middle Ages as the olden times. Baronets and ladies walk the streets of this mock medieval village, mingling with wizards and with Viking raiders. A druid in the coffee line is eating a bag of deep-fried pickles. Now come the horses for the joust, hung with colors, prancing. Now come the knights, some long of tooth and sitting heavy in the saddle, but knights anyway, of equal parts, gentleness and power. This is Camelot at its apogee, where chivalry is figured as a flower. The knights spur forward into a theater of battle. But Camelot would not be Camelot were it not unsound in some way that no enchantment could ever mend. Alas, for all the pageantry that must eventually stutter to an end. For the Scotch eggs and the crab cakes and the slow roasted mutton shoulder. Alas, for the dads in chainmail, pushing their kids uphill in strollers, to cars and SUVs waiting to carry their owners back past gas stations and off-ramps to jobs in Baltimore or DC, or over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge to the pretty little towns that dot the eastern shore. 8 weeks of the year, the Renaissance is here. There's really nothing much for the other 44. Camelot is what you feel nostalgic for, even before it fades. In addition to being American, I'm Canadian. I have one, my mother's American from Kentucky, and my dad is Canadian from Toronto. And so I grew up in Toronto and then have been living in the US for the last 20 years or so. But here's my Canada mug right here. But a few years ago, I had the opportunity to live in the house of this Canadian poet, now deceased Canadian poet, Al Purdy, who's sort of an iconic figure in Canadian literature, and his house has been, a few years ago, was turned into a residency program for Canadian poets. So I was there with my wife and my son, and we were living in this house where Al Purdy lived and wrote, and in fact is a house that Al Purdy himself built by hand, famously built by hand. So the poem is just called In Al Purdy's House. It is strange living in the house of a writer who has died. I use your cutlery, your typewriter. I read your autobiography while lying in your bed, trying to imagine Roblin Lake and this lakeside piece of land as they were 60 years ago, when you and Urith built the A-frame by hand with no experience of carpentry, using salvaged lumber and whatever materials you could find. Critics seem to always talk you up or talk you down, casting you as the forerunner of all Canadian poets who were to follow, or else as a roughneck and a clown. For me, it's enough that you were many times demoted during a war you found unreal, that you lived and wrote according to an image that you had in mind, that you called your house a drum for the north wind, a kind of knot in time. Your mother's good china is still here, asleep inside the hutch. History, your personal history, hangs around the record player, which I haven't dared to touch. But this year there's been so much rain, Roblin Lake has climbed up 15 feet on the grass, making an island of the short peninsula you and Urith added to the shore. Standing at the window near the kitchen, watching a single sailboat pass back and forth across a distance that couldn't be more than a mile from end to end, I feel a collapse of distinctions between the real and the unreal, between what has already taken place and what is happening right now, as if time had been folded over into itself like a sheet of folded steel. Cottage country becomes backcountry as houses along the shoreline blink out and disappear. I know better than to make myself at home in a house that isn't mine. Soon I'll leave the keys on the counter, step outside, and close the door. Maybe because I'm left-handed, I made my way through your collected poems back to front. So I ended with the love songs of a young man. Poems for women you seduced or thought you might seduce. And I began with your regrets, the many places you visited, and your elegies for friends who during my backward progress came to life one by one. I'm going to finish this section of the reading with two last poems, and then I'm going to move on. We'll move on to the question section of the talk. So this first poem is called Nostalgia. The museum was closed, so no one saw the statue of Adam tumble to the floor and break. No one saw the plywood pedestal collapsing when it couldn't hold the marble man 1 second more. Cameras weren't allowed at the scene of the accident, so no public images exist of the curators sifting through every fragment, hoping to rebuild Adam from the wreck. But you can imagine the disconnected hand still gripping the apple. You can imagine the head broken off at the neck. There's no going back to the garden, she said. No more reading poetry in the reservoir park. There won't be any more lunches in the green room or long weekends in New York. No traveling by ocean liner. No silk stockings, no poke bonnets, no broad fall pants for the men. No more collecting beach glass or writing out letters by fountain pen. As the man and woman walked deeper into exile from the garden outside of time, their memories of where they'd come from grew hazy and recombined, becoming pieces of a magic jigsaw that never would stay together or form any picture twice. Now a mystic wilderness where a hyena was licking the injured flank of a giraffe. Now a couple courting in the foreground of an ancient cenotaph. The lovers had invented nakedness and put on their garments made of shame. The children weren't children any longer, and everything had changed, except for the angel, whose particular job it was to stand at the garden gate forever, making sure the man and woman did not re-enter if they came back. And because angels don't mind laboring without reward, the angel didn't feel bored or disenchanted. He didn't spend eternity on the thought that he was getting punished because of something that somebody else had done. Whether he represented stubbornness, or human consciousness, or just himself, or the sun, he kept watching all directions, all at once, and never for a moment did he put down his burning sword. All right, I'm going to present one last poem, and then I'm going to move on to questions. And I see I've got a couple questions here, so I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you all. So this last poem is called On the Move. Now that my work's done and it's Saturday, now that my young son is out somewhere with his mom, I might as well roam all morning, spying on the filthy squirrels and on the shapes that disintegrating leaves have painted on the sidewalk. I might as well spend the morning talking to myself, hoping for meaning and unmeaning to braid and begin teaching me what to say. Some days I feel like a monarch at wing, meandering, not really deciding where I go, as programmed as the stubborn birds building nests of twigs and spit. Each bird pipes the song that it was taught and transmits the song to its own offspring. Earthworms driven up by last night's rain have squirmed onto the asphalt to slowly fry. I save some who glue and wriggle, but there are just so many, and they almost seem to want to die. Day by day, I'm feeling my way into fatherhood, learning what my son is to me, and I to him, my boy, my kid, an eight-toothed homunculus clutching an acorn in his fist, bewildered that a paper plate set down on the grass on a windy day won't stay put, but lofts and spins away. By the time I'm downtown, I'm turning back, in thought, if not yet with my feet. Before I'm back on my own street, I'll have twice walked by the little wedge of ground where people of this neighborhood bury their dead dogs and cats. A rawhide bone, a ball of yarn, waterlogged by the frowsy rain. Animals have never meant very much to me, but I've got them on the brain these days. How magnetic navigation brings spawning salmon home. How predation, variation, and the winnowing down of things gave shape to a world of species, giving them gills, wings, and feet. But I'd rather be dead than be a creature of any other kind. I walk upright, practicing the song of my species by speaking. Thanks. So I see there's some questions here, which is great. Laura asks, in Eloquence, what made you think of the centaur at the wedding feast? And why did you close the poem with that image? What a great question. I don't know if anyone's ever asked me that before. I feel like the I always, to a degree, work associatively when I write my poems, and sometimes I put in a line because it feels right. I put in a line because I think, yep, it seems like it belongs, and I see the sort of outline of a metaphorical connection, and I haven't fully articulated to myself rationally why it belongs there. And so when I speak of the meaning of my poems, I don't mean to suggest that there's only one meaning for the poems. I really believe very strongly. I mean, I take it as a real article of faith in my writing and in my teaching that poems suggest more than they mean. That a poem's meaning is partly the result of what the author meant, but it's also partly a result of what the reader finds there. So all of that preamble is just to say, this is what the centaur represents for me, and this is what the poem means to me. But you release a poem out into the world and it's going to mean something different to a different reader. And those are real meanings too. But for me, the poem is about coveting, that the speaker has this belief that he can just, that if he were only eloquent enough, he can have everything he wants. If he's eloquent enough, he says, I want things from poetry that it could never give. Power to undo, to mend, to compel forgiveness and forgive. that he has this great belief that if he can only be eloquent enough, that he can have everything he wants. And the centaurs, you know, in Greek mythology, the centaurs are coveters. They're violent. They're rapists. They show up at a feast and they show up at a wedding and they get drunk and go on a rampage. And the the speaker of eloquence thinks if only if I only could be eloquent, then I wouldn't be on the outside looking in, wouldn't be coveting, wouldn't want things I can't have. That's what it means to me. But again, the connections that occur to me when I read a poem, they're largely intuitive, and it's only later that I sort of think analytically about what each piece is doing there. And there's another question here that's, when did you develop your passion for poetry? Have you noticed any changes in your writing since becoming a father? And in answer to the first question, I've wanted to be a writer of some stripe for as long as I can remember. I was always praised for, as a kid, I was always praised for being verbal, and you know, I always, my hero when I was a boy was J.R.R. Tolkien, and I sort of imagined that I maybe would grow up to be a you know, a novelist, a fantasy novelist and a medievalist, and that's not quite how things have worked out, but it's I don't sort of a version of that. I think at some point I realized that I would that I was maybe less interested in stories than I am in words themselves, and in how words can create rhythmical structures and song-like effects. And I realized that you know, of course, there are novelists who write very musically as well, and of course, there are poets who tell stories. But it seemed to me, I guess, when I was in my mid-20s and beginning to really get serious about writing, that I sort of, to my surprise, and maybe even a little bit to my disappointment at first, I discovered that I really had much more aptitude for writing poems than stories. My stories often didn't really seem to have the plots were kind of flimsy, whereas I felt like what I really loved was just extravagances of language and using language to create rhythm and music and communicate that way. And as for the question about noticing changes in my writing since becoming a father, for sure, I feel that I feel that poems really are a reflection of the person who writes them. I mean, there's a poem is, it's almost like a, you know, a Rorschach test. You know, you put the words on the page, and as I say, sometimes you don't even quite know what you mean when you're writing the poem, but the meaning emerges through the act of writing. And so the poem, to a large, you know, from my perspective, kind of magical and mysterious degree, the poem ends up getting saturated with the thoughts and feelings and the personality of the person who wrote it. So yeah, I felt like my first book, which is called Charms Against Lightning, is very different from this second book, The Suicide Son. The poems in Charms Against Lightning, I wrote them in my late 20s, and I was not only not a father, I was single and was, you know, quite uncertain of my place in the world. I mean, now I'm, you know, living in relative bourgeois comfort as a professor, but when I wrote Charms Against Lightning, I was really kind of living hand to mouth. I mean, you know, I didn't have 2 cents to rub together really for most of the time that I was writing it, and the poems reflect that. You know, the poems in that first book are kind of stripped down, you know, edgy, got a lot of sharp turns, a lot of abrupt switches of mood and dramatic situation and style, and all of that to me seemed, I felt like a true expression of the feelings that I was trying to put across. But in writing the poems in The Suicide Son, I felt like it needed a different set of techniques, a different set of rhythmical tools to write the poems that were going to be true to what I was feeling at that time. You know, because especially when you have a newborn, you know, there's a lot of long, a lot of long, slow passage of time in those first few years of parenthood, or at least that was my experience of it. And you know, you end up. I felt like so much of my thinking was sort of retrospective thinking about my own childhood, my parents, um, seeing parallels in my son and myself, my son and my wife, myself and my parents, and so on. And I felt like in order to get there poetically, to write poems that could be vehicles for those kinds of thoughts, I had to write longer poems and write poems that would stay within a mood for a longer period of time. And that might just sound like it's just a matter of just writing more lines, but it's not. It's also a matter of, for it to work rhythmically and narratively, it's a matter also of changing up everything else. You know, the rhythms have to change, the rhymes have to change, the assonance, everything has to change. So, so yes, fatherhood did change my poems. And a question: where did the inspiration for the poems related to your son's books stem from? And what a great question, Tony. As I say, I was reading these books aloud to my son, and found them very moving. You know, I read these books. I read Dr. Seuss and Eric Carle, and a book I can't remember whose author. I can't think of the author's name, but it was a very popular one with my son for a period of a few months at least, called Good Night Construction Site. And it's so interesting, you know, it was interesting to me to see that children really, long before they can follow a narrative, long before they're able to really grasp a story and, you know, wonder about how the story is going to turn out and what's going to happen to the characters, long before they reach that level of linguistic understanding, they can respond to repetition and rhymes and pattern. Like they pick it up. And it, of course, you know, it makes sense because you think about children's books. I mean, I was struck by that reading Dr. Seuss and Eric Carle. I'm like, oh, all these books are poems. They're all poetry. They're not prose, they're poetry. And I thought, how weird that all these books for children, and Mother Goose, you know, they're all poetry. And there's something so primal, you know, that a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old still in a kind of a pre-verbal stage can understand them and relate to them and be engaged and moved by them. And I just thought there's something so fundamental about that, to how our minds work, that I felt like I wanted to tap into it. I wanted to try to get there in my own poems and write poems that would draw upon some of those very kind of elemental rhythms, partly just because you know, it's a pleasure to try to do things you haven't done before and look for ways of writing different kinds of poems from what you've written previously. But also, I just had these thoughts and feelings about fatherhood and childhood, and I wanted to find the right vehicle for communicating that to a reader. And then there's a question: in what ways do you think this time during the pandemic will influence your writing? Well, the honest answer is it's stalled my writing. I've been at home quarantining with my family for the last year, and have not written a great deal. And I have some friends who've had amazingly productive writing years. during the pandemic, but I have not. So I'm looking forward to the summer. I feel my teaching has wrapped up last week, and I'm really excited to reconnect with my poetry and and I don't quite know what I'm going to write about, but I have many notes written down on scraps of paper. In some ways, I feel that um, some ways I feel that uh, and writing a poem is a process of discovering what the poem is going to mean, what it's going to sound like, and so I never really know how it's all going to come together until it's done. But um, what I do feel is having written so many poems in the Suicide Sun, but also in my first book that really are driven by the I, the first person singular I, poems that are, about myself. Um, I really, I want to change that up. So I want to write some poems that are about other people, that are more based, that are more outward looking. Not that I am unhappy to have written the book that I have written, but I feel you have to keep changing, have to keep making it new. And so for me, one way of doing that I feel will be new and challenging and fun and rewarding, I hope, is to write poems about what I see around me and not so much about myself. Um, and a question, thinking of music and poetry, who are some songwriters that you're inspired by? And what an interesting question. I think there's a really um, close connection, of course, between song and poetry, and I mean, really, they began as the same thing, and it's only relatively recently that they've kind of become divergent art forms. When I was first starting to write, um, I guess this would have been almost 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, when I was first starting to write. Tom Waits was huge for me. I used to listen to. I had I had At first I had two Tom Waits CDs and I just listened to them on repeat. I had Beautiful Maladies, which was a kind of greatest hits, and I also had The Black Rider, which I was absolutely obsessed with. I would listen to it over and over and over again. Um, but now let's see, other songwriters who've been important to me. Leonard Cohen is important to me. Sinead O'Connor. Um, but also um, I feel like you take inspiration where you find it, and sometimes the things that inspire me that kind of get me going are not necessarily. Sometimes it's not always a great songwriter whose lines interest me. Sometimes I'll just hear a line from a song that's pure pop music, and I like the way it sounds, and I can sort of hear the rhythmical structure and think I should work with something like that. So uh, yeah, like actually, there's an example of one when I'm teaching creative writing during the semester at Johns Hopkins. I sometimes bring in pop lyrics and we actually talk about them rhythmically to make the point that, I mean, because sometimes when I'm talking about things like assonance or rhyme or meter, students will think, do poets really think about these things? Is this real, or is this just something that's only has meaning inside a classroom? And I'm like, oh, well, let me show you. And so I bring in one of my favorites is to bring in 4 lines from a Justin Bieber song, which is the song is Love Yourself. And it goes, because if you like the way you look that much, oh baby, you should go and love yourself. And if you think that I'm still holding on to something, you should go and love yourself. And the students are always amazed when I point out they are 4 lines of perfect rhyming iambic pentameter. So yeah, I mean, sometimes you can find verbal textures and places that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being highly poetic. I see there's some more questions here. Let me just scroll down. And Laura asks, who was the teacher who most influenced your poetry and in what ways? How did your Stegner Fellowship influence your writing? So I've been very fortunate in my teachers. I did an MFA at the University of Washington in Seattle. So now, sorry, an MFA is a Master of Fine Arts degree. And I did mine at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I had some wonderful teachers there. I had Linda Beards, Heather McHugh, Colleen McElroy, and Richard Kenny were my main professors there. And all of them have been important to me or in one way or another. But Richard Kenny's teaching in particular has sort of stayed with me. He often, he had a very unconventional way of teaching. I mean, he didn't take a narrow view of what should be discussed in a poetry classroom. So he would often bring in texts that were about the evolution of language. He had a summer program that encouraged us all to go to, where we all went to Rome, and he marched us around Rome for 5 weeks and got us to take notes on the sights of Rome and write poems and turn them around within 24 hours. But he had there were many principles that he sort of put forward to us that I continue to wrestle with and think about in relationship to my own writing. And then the Stegner Fellowship program, which I went to, I guess, about 4 years after finishing my Master of Fine Arts degree. This is a 2-year program at Stanford. It's a residency program for early career poets. And I was very fortunate to be able to go there, and I had wonderful teachers there as well. In particular, the late Evan Boland was a real mentor to me, as she's been for so many American poets, and very extremely rigorous reader of poems, and really pushed me to think more deeply about what I was doing with my own poetry. She was very distrustful of anything that she saw as kind of an intellectual conceit that paid no real dividend to the reader. She said that she often characterized herself in class as being an advocate for the reader, by which she meant that if a poem, doesn't matter how clever your idea is, or how good it is in theory, if it's not moving to a reader, then it doesn't work. And she was very rigorous in the application of that principle, getting us to think about how someone else might engage with our poems and whether our poems could really be understood by others and be moving to others. So I'm grateful to her for that. So it looks like we're reaching the end of our question period here. So I also wanted to let you know that I'm going to be giving a little 3-session talk on poetry through Hopkins at Home later this month. And I believe it's called How a Poem Begins. And I think our first session, it's going to be on Monday afternoons. I think the first one is Monday, May 17th. And so if you're interested, please participate. It would be a pleasure to get to know some of you and read your poems and work with you. So thanks for tuning in today, and all the best.